Okay, so let's start. So I'll cut it very short because we have been waiting for a while now. So I think I'll talk mainly about the purpose of this forum, which I'm starting online now. You know, my great-grandfather is Ludwig Boltzmann, and today, the 20th of February, is actually the day of his birthday. But he was born in 1844, so this is quite a while ago. Does that work? No. Okay. Okay. So the purpose, I started the Ludwig Boltzmann Forum about 15 years ago here in Tokyo, mainly with in-person meetings at the Embassy of Austria and also at other locations. And the embassy is like a government institution. So I organized the in-person meetings at the embassy more on a leadership level, you know, based on science and with a science bias. But I invited many leaders, and so the purpose was a leadership forum based on logic, science, technology to create impact and contribute to solutions of important issues. And since it's in Tokyo, then with a big focus also on the main issues in Japan, which are quite serious. Every country has serious issues. And now, starting with today, also strongly encouraged by Charles Clark, who is an old friend of, long-standing friend of mine, and who is also an exceptionally distinguished physicist, working a long career at the US government National Institute of Science and Technology. He also encouraged me strongly, and he will give soon the first talk of this online version. Now, in the online version, it's automatically global, and we can have topics where we focus on. So for next year, I'm planning one Ludwig Boltzmann Forum on, you know, physics of Ludwig Boltzmann and today's evolution of that, and a second one on 200 years of the second law of thermodynamics, which is very, very important. But, you know, it's a second law of thermodynamics usually it's something which physicists have close to their heart, but for example, people in politics and so on will maybe not have heard about it. This is a picture of the Ludwig Boltzmann Forum I organized, one of them I organized in Tokyo at the Embassy of Austria. And you can see here the ambassador of Austria in the middle, and Her Imperial Highness Takamado here, and Nobel Prize winner Shuji Nakamura, and Suematsu-san on the left here next to the window, who is the chief of the Medical Research Agency. And all the people you see here are key leaders of Japan's science and economics world and political leaders. And so we have this focus. For example, Shuji Nakamura was talking about lighting and various issues he wishes to improve in Japan. Now, this is, for example, the program of the 2016 Ludwig Boltzmann Forum I organized here in Tokyo. There was Shuji Nakamura, who talked both on his inventions and his ongoing work on gallium nitride and LEDs, but he also talked a lot about improvements he proposes based on his personal own experience in Japan's patent systems, in Japan's legal system, in Japan's intellectual property system, and many other suggestions he made for changes in Japan, which he is very passionate about. We had Professor Makoto Tsumatsu, who was the founding chairman of Japan's Agency for Medical Research Development, which is a Japan kind of reinvention of the US NIH. So US for many years has a national health institute, and Japan didn't have that. So Professor Suematsu was, on the request of the then Prime Minister, was creating this new medical research agency. So he talked about the background, why and how, and what the philosophy is. And he also worked on the main research topics he selected to emphasize for this medical research agency. Then we had Professor Michinari Hamaguchi. When I invited him, he was president of Nagoya University. He's also a medical scientist. But when he gave the talk, he was head of the Japanese Science and Technology Agency, which is something like the head of the Japanese version of NSF. Then I had invited Kyoko Nomura, who is a medical doctor. And the reason I invited her, because she created a center for supporting women physicians and researchers. So Ludwig Boltzmann, in his days, which is 200 years ago or 150 years ago, he was supporting women a lot. So Lise Meitner was one of his students, for example. And the most recent, because of the virus, I gave a break in the in-person Ludwig Boltzmann Forum sessions. The latest one I had was 2020. And sleep is one of the key issues globally, and also especially in Japan. Japanese people don't sleep enough, and that's a very serious issue. And Professor Yanagisawa is one of the top global research leaders in sleep, and he has just received this breakthrough prize in San Francisco. Mr. Ogata is the vice chairman of one of the largest railway companies in the world. Professor Nakauchi is professor both at Stanford and in Tokyo University, developing implants like artificial hearts, not artificial, natural hearts, created with gene technology. And Satoshi Nagata is one of the key top researchers in NTT Docomo. And this is now a family background. So now our family, and Roland, my brother, is also here. We have two kind of family trees here. One is the Boltzmann family, and the other is the Chiari family. And Chiari family they came from north of Italy. And they are all, many of them are medical doctors, and some of them are very, have illnesses named after them. And I don't want to go into details here, but there's, for example, Johann Chiari, who was a gynecology professor in Vienna, or Ottokar von Chiari, who was a laryngologist, so ear, nose, and throat specialist, and he made one of the breakthrough operations. And then Ludwig Boltzmann, we just talked with Charles. Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say one word. If you talk about medicine and Chiari, what you just mentioned, our grandfather Ottokar Chiari, he was the founder of ENT, modern ENT surgery. He was actually the private doctor of the Emperor of Austria and his wife Sissi, and he was the first ever to develop transbronchial surgery. So he founded the ENT University Hospital in Vienna. And someone who is not on the list is also Karl Chiari, who is an uncle of us, who founded orthopedic surgery in Vienna. So there are some very, very, very prominent people. Sorry to interrupt.
Then there's Gerhard Fasol, who is a big heart surgeon. Okay. Ludwig Boltzmann lived from 1844 to 1906. And we use Ludwig Boltzmann's results every day. There are too many to list. I'm just listing some here. Maybe one formula which is on his gravestone, which very many people know, is this entropy equals Boltzmann's constant times logarithm of the probability W, but W stands for Wahrscheinlichkeit. And we don't have time now to go into details, but essentially in this context, Boltzmann's main work can be summarized by saying that he linked the macroscopic entropy to the statistics of molecules, so to the microscopic world, and then also to information theory, which was kind of rediscovered by Shannon. And entropy has many, many faces, and there are many aspects to entropy. When Shannon discovered his concept of what later was called entropy, he asked his friends and said, what should I call this? And his friends told him, call it entropy, because Boltzmann has already invented something similar concept, or was working on a similar concept as you were. And the second advantage of calling it entropy is because it's so difficult to understand. So if you understand it, you always have an advantage. That's a picture of his high school years. Ludwig Boltzmann, he finished high school at the age of 19, and 2 years after he finished high school, at the age of 21, he published his first scientific paper, which is called Über die Bewegung der Elektrizität in krummen Flächen in 1865. Translated to English, it means something like electricity on curved surfaces. That was his PhD thesis. And about 20% of Boltzmann's work was about electromagnetism. So, you know, his life overlapped much with Maxwell Boltzmann's life, who created the so-called, Maxwell's life, where in England, in Cambridge, where Maxwell created Maxwell's equations, and Ludwig Boltzmann spent a lot of time working on this. Let's skip over this. Yeah, yes. So I inherited Boltzmann's, what is left of Boltzmann's writing and notebooks and lecture notes, and many of them were unpublished. And I made sure over the years that these works were transcribed and published, most of them in Springer Verlags in books. And this is a notebook with Boltzmann's private notes, lecture preparations, and you can see sketches here. And Ludwig Boltzmann used a shorthand which is called Gabelsberger. It's a form of Gabelsberger shorthand, which was in use at that time in Vienna. And I still learned shorthand in school in Vienna, but today nobody, I think, uses shorthand anymore. But in those days, Boltzmann had his notebooks all written in this shorthand, and it was it was a kind of like a reinvention of this shorthand by himself. So he had these abbreviations for all the physical terms he was using. And there are, I think my mother, who unfortunately died 2 years ago, I think she was the only person in the world who can read this. And she described, I invited her to, convinced her to spend her time converting this. Where is this? No, wait a second. Okay, yeah. So you can see his notes here. Ludwig Boltzmann was incredibly fond of music, and particularly of Beethoven, and he said he couldn't live without Beethoven. Then here is his life, where he the major stages in his professional life. So at the age of 21, he published his first scientific publication on electricity on curved surfaces. In 23, he became what was called Privatdozent at that time. And at the age of 25, he became full professor in Graz. And then he married at age 32. At age 43, he was rector, so president of University of Graz for 2 years, 1 or 2 years. Then he moved to Berlin. He rejected he was offered a professorship in Berlin, rejected it, went to München for, I think, 4 years. Then he came back to Vienna, and then he was for a short time in Leipzig, and then he moved back to Vienna. So I have made a sketch here of all his professional moves. So he can see he was a very active international man, even in those days when there was no internet and no flying. So he was moving with the steam trains and ships, and he went 3 times to the United States. So when he went to the United States, he took the train to Bremen, and then took the ship from Bremen to US. And there's a very funny story about one of his 3 visits to US, which I heard through my family, great vine, that in Bremen at the harbor, all his money was stolen, and in those days there were no credit cards, you know, so no bank wire transfers. So he arrived in New York for this trip to where he would give talks in New York, and then he would go, I don't know, I forgot if he went to Boston, but he went to California and gave talks at Berkeley and at Stanford, and I think he visited also a World Exhibition conference in St. Louis. So he borrowed money from the captain of the ship, and then when he arrived in New York, he got received these lecture fees, and so he refunded the money he had borrowed from the captain from out of his lectureship fees he received in New York. So that's his 3 trips to US. He had an English teacher whose name was May O'Callaghan. So the reason I tell you that is that in those days, he was already a very, very international scientist. He was in correspondence with all the major scientists of his time, and he compared the British, US, the Anglo-Saxon university system with the German, Austrian university system, and he was telling people in Germany and in Austria, oh my God, you know, I've seen how the discussions are free and lively in US, and we should also have these lively discussions without hierarchies here, and we should also introduce that in Germany and Austria. So I think, yes, maybe the last point I'll make before we switch on to Charles Clark, who will give the next lecture. I should also say that he was a great supporter of women, which in those days was quite exceptional because, for example, his later wife, Henriette von Eigentler, who is my great-grandmother, therefore, she was refused the permission to even to audit the lectures at Graz University. You know, it was, of course, she wasn't allowed to be a student, but even auditing, even listening to some of the lectures without taking exams and without being formally admitted as a student was not permitted. So he advised her to appeal this decision and helped her to get into Graz University, and later he married her. And I don't know what the sequence is of this. And so in 1874, she passed the exams as a high school teacher. And in 1876, so two years later, after she finished her studies as high school teacher, they married. And you can see here the picture of probably their marriage picture. I have many more slides prepared here. So this is also their marriage picture. I have, this is his family, Ludwig Boltzmann's family. So my grandfather is also on this picture here in the middle. And it's just when he was 42 years old, just when he was just going to be the president of Graz University. Okay, so I'll stop my little introduction about Ludwig Boltzmann here. Stop share. And we'll start the science program here with Charles Clark.